Women's suffrage in the U.S. 1920. The 19th Amendment grants voting rights. Introduction. A historic victory for equality. The women's suffrage movement in the United States was one of the most significant social and political movements in American history. For over 70 years, women fought tirelessly for the right to vote, advocating for gender equality and justice. Their struggle culminated in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote and marked a major victory for women's rights. This achievement not only changed the lives of American women, but also laid the groundwork for future advancements in gender equality. 1. The early roots of the suffrage movement. The fight begins in the 19th century. The struggle for women's suffrage in the United States began in the mid-19th century, at a time when women had few rights outside of the home. Women were largely excluded from political life, and the idea of women participating in elections was unthinkable to many. The movement found its earliest spark in the abolitionist and women's rights circles. Many women who were advocating for the abolition of slavery also began to call for equal rights for women. One of the first public meetings focused on women's rights was the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. This event marked the beginning of the organized fight for women's suffrage in the U.S. and laid the groundwork for the suffrage movement. The early leaders and their advocacy. Women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and Alice Paul emerged as key figures in the suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, in 1869, focused on securing the right to vote through a constitutional amendment. Lucy Stone and others formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, which advocated for state-level suffrage amendments. Though their strategies differed, both organizations worked toward the same ultimate goal. 2. The rise of the suffrage movement. The growing momentum in the late 19th century. The movement for women's suffrage gained significant momentum in the late 19th century. By the turn of the 20th century, a number of states had granted women the right to vote in local or state elections, most notably Wyoming, which became the first state to grant full suffrage to women in 1869. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, led by Carrie Chapman Catt and Susan B. Anthony, worked to unite the efforts of women across the country, pushing for a constitutional amendment to guarantee women the right to vote in federal elections. As the movement grew, new generations of women began to take leadership roles, and the cause gained increasing support from men and women alike. The role of women in World War I. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 further strengthened the suffrage movement. Women's significant contributions to the war effort, both in the workforce and in support of the military, highlighted their capabilities and further argued for their inclusion in the democratic process. Women worked in factories, served as nurses, and supported war efforts at home, all of which proved their essential role in society. In 1917, President Woodrow Wilson finally declared his support for the suffrage amendment, stating that granting women the right to vote was a war measure, a way to honor the contributions of women during the war. The path to the 19th Amendment. The formation of the National Woman's Party. While the NAWSA continued to work on lobbying state legislatures and Congress, a more militant faction of suffragists emerged, led by Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party, NWP. Alice Paul and her followers adopted more aggressive tactics, including hunger strikes, picketing in front of the White House, and demanding that the government recognize women's right to vote. These women faced arrest and imprisonment, and their sacrifices brought significant attention to the suffrage movement, intensifying pressure on lawmakers. Congressional support and resistance. In 1918, the U.S. Congress passed the 19th Amendment, but it was met with stiff opposition in the Senate. The amendment fell short of the necessary votes for ratification by just one vote. However, After years of relentless campaigning, pressure from women's groups, and the political climate changing in favor of suffrage, the amendment was reintroduced in 1919 and finally passed by Congress. 4. Ratification of the 19th Amendment. The final push for ratification. After passing in Congress, the 19th Amendment needed to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures to become law. The final battle took place in the states, where suffragists lobbied lawmakers to support the amendment. The movement faced fierce opposition, particularly from southern states, where racism and fear of social upheaval played a significant role. Despite this opposition, the suffrage movement reached its final triumph when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, 1920. The 19th Amendment becomes law. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was officially certified, granting women the constitutional right to vote. The amendment stated, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." 5. The impact of the 19th Amendment. A victory for women's rights. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was a historic victory, not only for women's suffrage, but also for the broader women's rights movement. Women were now allowed to participate in national elections, choosing their representatives and influencing policies at every level of government. In the years following the passage of the 19th Amendment, women began to run for office and hold positions of political power, including in Congress and local governments. The passage of the 19th Amendment also served as a catalyst for other social movements advocating for gender equality, such as those fighting for equal pay, access to education, and reproductive rights. The struggle was not over. Although the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, the fight for full equality was far from over. Racial discrimination prevented many women, particularly African American women in the South, from exercising their voting rights, as poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation tactics were used to disenfranchise them. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that many of these barriers were removed, ensuring that all women, regardless of race, could vote freely and equally. 6. Legacy of the suffrage movement. A lasting impact on U.S. democracy. The success of the suffrage movement marked a major step forward in the ongoing struggle for equality in the United States. It symbolized a shift toward greater inclusion in the democratic process and helped establish the idea that full citizenship included the right to vote, regardless of gender. The 19th Amendment was a turning point in the fight for women's rights that laid the groundwork for future social, political, and legal victories. Inspiration for global suffrage movements. The American women's suffrage movement also inspired similar movements around the world, with many countries following suit in granting women the right to vote in the early 20th century. The victory in the United States was an example of how determined activism, political pressure, and social change could overcome centuries of inequality. A milestone in the fight for equality. The 19th Amendment was not just a legal victory. It was the result of decades of struggle, sacrifice, and perseverance by women who refused to accept inequality. It was a defining moment in American history, marking the beginning of a new era in which women could participate fully in the democratic process. While the battle for gender equality is ongoing, the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 remains one of the most significant milestones in the fight for justice and equality in the United States.
Harlem Renaissance, 1920s, 1930s, a cultural and social movement for African Americans. Introduction: a flourishing of African American culture. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural, intellectual, and artistic explosion that took place during the 1920s and 1930s, centered in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. This era marked a turning point for African American culture, with Black artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals producing a rich body of work that reflected the challenges and joys of the African American experience. The Harlem Renaissance was not just an artistic movement, but also a social and political force, challenging the prevailing racial stereotypes and advocating for a new sense of pride, identity, and purpose for African Americans in a racially segregated society. 1. Background: the Great Migration and Harlem's rise. The Great Migration. The Harlem Renaissance was deeply influenced by the Great Migration, the mass movement of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North, particularly to cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia between 1916 and 1970. African Americans were fleeing the oppressive conditions of the South, including Jim Crow laws, racial violence, and economic hardship. In the North, they sought better job opportunities, political freedom, and a more favorable environment for racial progress. Harlem, a historically black neighborhood in Manhattan, became a central hub for African American culture, attracting writers, musicians, and intellectuals. Harlem as a cultural mecca. By the early 1920s, Harlem had established itself as a vibrant cultural epicenter for Black Americans. This area of New York became a melting pot of African American culture, where artists, intellectuals, and everyday people created an atmosphere of creativity and political activism. Harlem was home to jazz clubs, theaters, speakeasies, and cafes that attracted a diverse crowd of intellectuals, artists, and white patrons seeking to experience this unique cultural energy. The neighborhood's sense of community, freedom, and creativity made it the ideal place for the Harlem Renaissance to take root. 2. Key figures of the Harlem Renaissance. Writers and poets. The Harlem Renaissance produced a new generation of Black writers who explored the complexities of African American identity, culture, and the experience of living in a racially divided society. Langston Hughes, perhaps the most famous figure of the movement, wrote poetry, essays, and plays that celebrated African American culture and critiqued racism and inequality. His works like The Negro Speaks of Rivers and I, Too, are powerful reflections of Black pride and resilience. Zora Neale Hurston, another important writer, captured the lives and voices of Black women in works like Their Eyes Were Watching God, giving voice to the stories of Southern African American women. Claude McKay, a Jamaican-born poet, explored themes of racism, class struggle, and Black resistance, contributing poems like If We Must Die to the movement. Countee Cullen and Jean Toomer also contributed to the literary landscape, pushing boundaries and producing work that gained national attention. Musicians and jazz legends. The Harlem Renaissance is often associated with the explosion of jazz, blues, and other African American musical genres that dominated the scene during this time. Duke Ellington, one of the most important figures in jazz, performed at the Cotton Club, bringing his innovative compositions to the mainstream. Louis Armstrong, whose virtuosic trumpet playing and improvisational skills made him one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century, became a central figure in the jazz world. Bessie Smith, known as the Empress of the Blues, became a legendary singer whose powerful voice conveyed the struggles and triumphs of African American women. Cotton Club and Apollo Theater became iconic venues where Black artists could showcase their talents to predominantly white audiences. Visual artists. Visual artists, too, found inspiration in the Harlem Renaissance, exploring themes of African American history, culture, and identity through their paintings and sculptures. Aaron Douglas, known as the father of African American art, combined modernist techniques with African themes to create powerful images of Black life. His murals and illustrations, such as those in aspects of Negro life, became emblematic of the Harlem Renaissance. Lois Mailou Jones and Archibald Motley also contributed to the visual arts, bringing the realities and beauty of African American life to the forefront of the cultural movement. Intellectuals and political leaders. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just about art and music. It also had a significant intellectual and political component. W.E.B. Du Bois, a prominent African American sociologist and civil rights activist, played a critical role in fostering Black intellectual thought during this period. His concept of the talented tenth, The idea that the most educated and skilled African Americans should lead the charge for social and political change was influential in shaping the future of African American activism. Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican-born leader, advocated for Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, encouraging African Americans to take pride in their heritage and seek economic independence through organizations like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. Alain Locke, a philosopher and educator, is often referred to as the father of the Harlem Renaissance. His work encouraged Black artists and writers to embrace their heritage and create art that reflected the complexities of Black life in America. 3. The impact of the Harlem Renaissance. Challenging racial stereotypes. The Harlem Renaissance played a vital role in reshaping the image of African Americans in the public eye. Black artists, writers, and performers rejected the stereotypical portrayals of Black people as inferior or subservient, offering a more complex and multifaceted view of African American life. The Renaissance's focus on Black pride, cultural expression, and intellectual achievement helped to combat racist notions and uplift African Americans' sense of self-worth. Through literature, music, and art, Black intellectuals and artists redefined African American identity, paving the way for the civil rights movement and future cultural revolutions. A national movement. Although the Harlem Renaissance was centered in Harlem, its influence spread across the nation. Black artists and writers from across the country, including cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., were part of this larger cultural awakening. The movement had an impact on mainstream American culture, helping to shape attitudes toward race and challenging long-held beliefs about African Americans. New opportunities for African Americans. The Harlem Renaissance also opened up new opportunities for African Americans in various fields. African American musicians and performers found national fame, with jazz becoming a dominant genre in American music. African American writers found their voices amplified in the literary world, gaining wider recognition and earning the respect of white audiences and critics alike. The movement also encouraged Black pride and a renewed sense of empowerment, motivating future generations to continue fighting for civil rights and social change. 4. Decline of the Harlem Renaissance. The end of the era. The Harlem Renaissance began to lose momentum in the early 1930s due to several factors. The Great Depression had a significant economic impact, draining financial resources and limiting opportunities for artists and intellectuals. The rise of political conservatism and the onset of World War II shifted national attention away from cultural movements, and many Black intellectuals and artists turned their focus to political and social activism in response to the economic and racial challenges of the time. Despite these changes, the Harlem Renaissance's influence continued to resonate in the years that followed, particularly with the rise of the civil rights movement and the Black arts movement in the 1960s and 1970s. 5. Legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. A cultural revolution. The Harlem Renaissance represents a cultural revolution that had lasting effects on the arts, politics, and social identity of African Americans. It established the idea of Black as beautiful and encouraged future generations to embrace their cultural heritage and fight against the forces of racism and inequality. The movement helped shape the trajectory of African American culture, providing a foundation for the civil rights movement and subsequent Black empowerment movements. Influence on future generations. The writers, musicians, artists, and intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance continue to inspire artists, activists, and thinkers around the world. The works of Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and many others remain central to the study of American history and literature. The Renaissance's focus on African American identity, culture, and self-expression continues to resonate in the arts and social movements of today. A defining moment in American history. The Harlem Renaissance was more than just an artistic movement. It was a moment of profound cultural transformation for African Americans. It provided a platform for Black artists and intellectuals to assert their identity, challenge racism, and celebrate African American heritage. This era of creativity and empowerment reshaped American culture and laid the groundwork for future civil rights and social justice movements, ensuring that the voices and experiences of African Americans would never be overlooked again.